Yum, yum!
Hi, it's Alex. I'm gonna talk about multipath compositing today. For that, I've set up a Modo scene, but this is really not Modo specific. It's more of a general compositing tutorial. So it's a very basic scene, just threw in a few basic items with a few different materials. And I've filled up the render outputs, the AOVs, with everything that's under, let's see, lighting, material, and shading. That's basically the ones that are of interest to us. So as you can see here, that's the image, the final one. We also can look at all the individual passes. So all that's getting output. I've also, with the help of Adam's great Pacify plugin, which has the ultralight in it, I can create a pass, a render pass for each light. So each light gets rendered in isolation. And I've kept all the passes intact for that as well. So if we look at that in Nuke, these are the rendered layers. This is the main one. It'll come in as black because the Nuke looks for RGBA as a layer, and the layer in the Modo scene was called Final Color, so that'll be under Final Color here. But you can see that's the final rendering, and we have all the passes in here. So we have diffuse color and diffuse amount, etc. If you want to look at them all together, you can look at the layer contact sheet. So basically that's all the different passes. I've also split them out with shuffle nodes, so you can look at them individually without going to the layers drop down. It just makes it a little bit more visual. Same thing for the individual lights. So you have the yellow light with all the passes, the luminous material pass, the turquoise light, and the purple one. So basic compositing of the of the main one is what I'm going to tackle first. The most common one, I'd say, is the additive passes. So that's basically trying to recreate how the renderer deals internally with all the rays, and that's basically mimicking how light works. So light is energy, and you can only add energy into an image. There's no energy sucking ray yet, so sucking out energy of the scene, that's, as far as I know, not physically possible yet. So what we're doing here is basically just rebuild what physics does. So we take the diffuse direct contribution and add it to black. And we take the indirect and plus or add that on top, and do so with the main passes. Which passes exactly those are, that's renderer specific. I've written out the compositing formulas for a few common ones. The Modo one, or basically all of these, you can get by looking in the manual of your application. For Modo, that would be under, is it rendering, render outputs, and then scroll way down. Output items, basic render outputs, there it is. Scroll way down, you get the compositing outputs section, which has the formula here. And I've written out a few other ones. So depending on which renderer you use, you need to add together different formulas. RenderMan even has a minus in there, which I would highly discourage, but that's how they do that. So if you use RenderMan and output the default AOVs, that's the way to count them. But all the others basically just add the light contribution as it would happen in physics. In Formodo, that is the luminous, the subsurface, the specular, the reflection, the transparent, and diffuse indirect, and the diffuse direct. Those are all added together. And do that. You get your final image. And if you compare that with the original, the final color output, that's identical. So in here, I'm doing a difference. And you see, like there's if you look down here, very minor values, but those are basically rounding errors. You get the same image out. So now with the multipass setup, I can go into the merge node and just mix and match the individual light contributions. So turning off the direct light, that's just GI, and all the others. I can obviously grade each individual pass on their own, so amping up the direct light. If I'm doing that, I'm obviously breaking the physical correctness, because the direct light should influence the indirect and vice versa. But in itself, the direct light stays consistent, obviously. I can also start doing some color changes just in the direct light. And obviously at a certain point, it just falls apart. Doing a green direct light and nothing in the scene reacts to that. That's obviously not what we want. But minor changes usually work quite well. Just adding a little bit of contrast or whatever. One thing that's also nice is you can see in the indirect probably, yeah, there's still a little bit of noise left. I didn't want to wait for a finished render. So I can denoise just the GI. Maybe crank it up. And if we compare that, the final color, you can see that in the compressed video. So that's the final color, and that's my denoised image. If I denoise the final color instead, you can see the whole image is starting to soften a bit, especially noticeable in the refractions and reflections here. Maybe that's what I want, maybe not, but at least here with the split, I have the option of, say, just denoising the reflection and the transparent. Let's do that again. There you go. Just enough to get rid of the noise. And now we maybe can see a little bit of difference in here. So that's denoised over the whole image, and that's just the individual channels denoised. Not sure if you can actually see that in the screen capture, but over here we get major softening, which we don't get in the individual channel denoise, obviously. So that's one way to go. Split up your passes according to the render engine and dial those in. And that's the workflow I would advise, because everything is additive and it's really hard to break. I mean, obviously grading the direct light green and then not having it affect anything else in the scene is going to break the physical correctness, but there's the subtractive method, which can introduce negative values and other stuff like that in your scene, and I would recommend against that. But the downside with the additive passes is you're always working with at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 data streams that you have to manipulate and compute. If you are constrained for bandwidth, for example, what you might want to do is just grab the final color. So you have your main data stream, and then whichever pass or light contribution you want to adjust, you can use that to subtract it from the final color, which gives you this, which is basically everything except the direct light. And then you have the option of taking the direct light contribution and grading that and plussing it on top again. So I have a grade of 2 here. Oops, that's basically the same as me looking at the final image and adding a grade of 2 in the additive version. Both of those, they should be identical, and they are. Now the from operation is basically b minus a, so I take the b and subtract the a input. Subtraction is always tricky because that introduces the potential for negative values, which will screw up your composite majorly down the road, potentially. So the subtractive workflow, I find that quite often as well in bigger studios, but it's tricky to work with because you need to be very careful to not introduce negative values. And they can be a little bit tricky to spot when suddenly your nuke renders or your compositing renders output weird colors and frames start flickering from frame to frame and stuff like that. It's sometimes really hard to track down. The image might look okay, but you've introduced negative values somewhere. And then you're in a tough spot because sometimes the look you've comped gets approved, but you've comped it on a faulty comp, and now you're asked to render that, but you can't because the comp's broken with negative values, and if you fix the negative values, your look changes, and then you're really in trouble to get that stuff fixed. So subtractive does work, but be really, really careful about that. Over here, we have the additive passes, but we're also splitting up the diffuse a little bit more. So over here we have the diffuse indirect and diffuse direct output as Modo outputs them for us. If we want a little bit more finer control, Modo also outputs the illumination direct and the that's the direct one, and the illumination indirect. So that's the pure light contribution. To get the diffuse versions of that, you basically need to also output the diffuse color, which is basically just whatever color value your shader outputs, the diffuse amount, which is just a value between 0 and 1 of the object, which you multiply with your color to get that. Then you also need the energy conserve output, which basically deals with glancing angles and stuff like that, and multiply that in to this. And if you multiply that with your light contribution, you get, in this case, the diffuse direct, which looks like this. So there's a little bit of a difference, as you can already see. And the indirect looks like that. and that output from Modo directly. That's a little bit closer. Still a tiny difference, which is why I would actually advise against this. You can output it and fiddle with it a little bit more, but it's not 100% exact science. But then again, if you split that out into passes, that's usually because you want to change and adjust the passes anyway. So really, who gives a damn if that's an exact match what the final color looks like? You're gonna change it anyway and tweak it. So whatever works in my book, really. Back down here, it's really the same workflow again. So we have the diffuse reconstructed, and then we just add it to reflection, refraction, and so on. Modo also outputs a few other channels, but those are not as useful, at least not for recreating the final color pass. You have specular and specular coefficient, SSS color, and SSS amount, which don't really correspond to the subsurface AOV. They are more concerned with the actual color that's in the color swatch, not what the renderer computes as the subsurface scattering. So those not as useful. Transparent amount and color is the same thing. It's whatever is the color in the transparent color swatch on the material, not what Modo actually sees as the what happens in the refraction. So those also not as useful. Roughness is basically also just a tech pass. You have the incidence, which can be useful for compositing. Also doesn't really play into the multi-pass compositing. And you have the normals. There's also an object normal, which computes the normal before any shading changes happen. So if you look closely at the donut in the shading normal, that's a smooth surface because the render engine has computed the subdivision surfaces, so you get a smooth surface. The object normal doesn't do that, so you get the actual polygons for the sphere or for the ball as well. You do still get the displacement because that's an actual geometry change. I don't think I've ever really seen a good use for the object normal. I always use the shading normal to do relighting and stuff like that. The point world, same thing, very useful for relighting or picking masks, which we are not discussing here today. That's about it, I think. Sometimes you don't have access to just the illumination, but you need to adjust the light. But the only thing you get, for example, is the diffuse, which has the color of the texture baked in. So how do you go about extracting just the light so you can adjust the light without touching the textures? Usually you get, the diffuse indirect. You could ask for just the texture color. If you divide that with the direct light, you get something that is very similar to the illumination on its own. It's not a perfect match, and the teapot here, that's simply because it has a very, very low diffuse value because it's mostly transparent. So if you divide that out, you get really bright values. And then if you multiply it back together with the color values, you get basically the same thing. So if you now grade just the light, I don't know, something a bit more blue maybe. Or let's do it. Let's make it more reddish and multiply the color back in. You've now adjusted the light without adjusting the texture. So basically this gives you a little bit finer control over the light at the expense of a little bit more inaccuracies if you compare. Oops, this one. So there's a slight difference how the back facing or the glancing angles get computed. Next, we also can just do the same additive trick with the lights. So we have the yellow light added to black. I like to do the added to black thing because then I can just mix the strength of the yellow as well. Then we can add the luminous and the turquoise and the purple. I've a grade down here because the uber light splits up the lights with a little extra headroom, 20% more headroom, meaning they get 20% brighter. I'm just grading that down here to get the same light level as the final color. So if you compare that, they match again. But now I can turn on and off the lights individually. And if I do that on the whole image, I can actually shift colors around and stay physically accurate because all the refractions and reflections react correctly. So I can just make that a really ugly green and all the refractions just react naturally as they would if I just rendered that light with that intensity and that tone of green, which is a really powerful way of doing the compositing. And again, here I have individual control over the denoising per light. So if one light gives you trouble and you don't want to increase the samples, just denoise that individual pass. And of course, one can, and I've done this here, go into the extreme and do an additive compositing of each light for like ultimate flexibility and compositing madness, because that's just a nightmare to balance and juggle. But you could grade each individual component of each individual light pass and then obviously control each completed composite on their own again, which can be useful, but that's usually not the first thing my mind would jump to. That's pretty much a special case. So personally, I'd go with the common additive or the per light. The per light is actually not as common, though very useful, at least not as common in the FX stuff I usually work with. We usually work with the normal additive passes, but each has their uses, and I just wanted to show you an overview of all of them. And I hope I could show you that there's no special black magic going on. It's really just a few pluses, minuses, adding stuff together. And in my book, and usually in the productions I've been a part of, physical correctness is a nice starting point, but whatever looks good is what works. Just look that there's no technical big holes in your comp, like negative values that can bite you at a later stage, and you're pretty much good to go. As far as matching the renderer's look, the additive passes is certainly the closest match, the closest option, followed by the Perlite additive version. All the others come with their trade-offs, being it little edge inaccuracies or a little bit of differences in how certain areas appear shaded. But again, if the image at the end looks okay, then it works in my book. I'm also including a bare bones fusion comp that shows the basic structure. Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to build out the whole fusion thing because working with layered EXRs in Fusion is tedious to say the least, because you need to come into the Format tab and pick your channels one by one. There's no layer structure similar to the one Nuke uses, where one image you have access to all the layers with a single click. That concept just doesn't exist in Fusion. So to have the additive passes, you need to duplicate your read node, and this one is set to diffuse RGB. Duplicate it again, and this one is set to diffuse indirect. And then I have a channel boolean to add them together. So we have the direct. We probably should enable our LUT. We have the indirect, and we add them together. And now I can add a grade node in here as well, adjusting my direct light. I also can, instead of using the boolean, I can just do a regular merge, same result. Or I can do it with an expression in the custom tool. Subtractive passes work the same, so you have your diffuse and your indirect, or whatever that was, final color. And the diffuse, I subtract that, I grade my diffuse, and I plus that back on top. Here I've reduced the gamma a little bit. So the same thing I've done in Nuke works here as well. I've just not taken the time to build that out completely. But if you feel so inclined and want to try it in Fusion, this should get you started. Also, the Perlite EXRs are included in here. Yeah. So that'll be part of the download package, as well as the Nuke script and the source images, as well as the formulas I've compiled as HTML. See you again soon. Bye.
Yum, yum!